So, we're going to take a brief minute to talk about inferential statistics. We have looked at descriptive statistics, which we said describe. And remember, I said that statisticians aren't particularly creative. So, inferential statistics infer. So, descriptives describes, inferential infers. And what does it infer? Well, basically, we take a sample of a population, we do a study on it, and then we infer that based on our sample, our population will behave a certain way. So the idea is that we're in inferential statistics, you're not just describing something, you're able to predict something. You're able to come to some type of conclusion, and you're assured that the conclusion that you come to is significant. So, what are inferential statistics? Well, first of all, they are predictions. So, we are predicting what the population will do based on our sample. So, this allows us to make a prediction or an inference, hence the name inferential, about the population based on the data that we collect and analyze from the sample. Is that always 100% the case? No. We know that there's some inherent risk that our sample could mispredict our population, but we try to do everything we can to ensure that our sample is non-biased and that it's representative of the population, which then helps us be sure that we can mitigate as many risks as possible with it not predicting. Inferential statistics also go beyond something that's descriptive. So, in a descriptive statistic, really we're just summarizing things. There's not a lot of context. There's not a lot of, we're not checking for bias. We're not looking at reliability and validity and all these other components that inferential statistics have. And we're really just looking at what are the qualities of a data set and descriptive. Whereas an inferential, we want to make a conclusion about the population. So again, and descriptive, we're really just summarizing what we're seeing, characteristics, trends, and we really don't even know, like, is this trend significant with what I'm seeing? Because that's inferential statistics job. So that leads us to determining statistical significance. And that's a tough concept because you might do an intervention in your classroom that increases the unit test score by a letter grade, but that letter grade could be insignificant. So if a student is going from a 40 to a 50 on a test, it's still an F. That may not have statistical significance. We would have to look at the inferential statistics. So this is why inferential is so important in quantitative research, because you might see an increase, but that increase in the context of what's going on may not justify whatever intervention you're trying to say because it is not statistically significant. Inferential statistics has a whole body of different types of analyses. For the purposes of our class, we're going to look at t-tests, ANOVAs, regressions, and chi-squared as different suitable research methods for the dissertation. So kind of your takeaway is that inferential statistics allow us to draw conclusions. It is powerful because it tells us if something is statistically significant, and it lets us make informed predictions or decisions about a population based on the sample that we're looking at. So remember, a population is the whole group. So all the students in the US population. A sample might be the subset of that population. So in the example we have here, if you're interested in studying all college students, that's obviously far too lofty of a goal. Like, we're not going to be able to track down every college student. So we would create a subset of the population, which is called our sample. And so maybe we would pull 200 college students from 5 different universities. Now, we know that there are far more than 5 universities in the world, but I'm trying to create some diversity in the group that I'm gathering so that my sample is representative of the population. So that means that I might want to look at public schools, private schools for higher ed. I might want to include an HBCU. So I'm basically trying to represent the universities in my 5 school sample, if that makes it easier. Anytime we can sample with random sampling where the individuals are randomly chosen, that's the ideal. It's not always possible in education, though, because in education, we don't want to give one student an unfair advantage over another one. So instead of doing random sampling, we'll often do cluster or stratified sampling where an entire class would get a treatment. But I can select classes at random and ensure that they get that treatment. And so that's kind of something that we'll talk about as we get into reliability and validity. But just know that it is kind of not common for us to do true random sampling simply because that means that student A gets an intervention while student B does not, and then that causes problems with ethics. If I'm talking about non-random sampling, there are a couple that I want to avoid in a dissertation. So it's okay not to randomly select students, but I don't want to use what we call a convenient sample, which is who is convenient to me as a researcher. We don't want to use volunteer samples where people volunteer to answer information because we have no control over that sample being representative of our population. And so that's really what it comes down to is if we don't sort of control who is in our sample, in a way that makes sure it's representative of gender, of ethnicity, of socioeconomic status, of so many different factors, then it gets a lot of bias and it gets out of hand and we can't use our findings. So with non-random sampling, we can't use those two in particular, but you could use a stratified sample, you could use a cluster sample, and you could even select your clusters at random to give it a little bit extra validity and reliability. Statistical significance, we're going to talk about a fair amount in class because statistical significance is a really critical concept when we talk about inferential statistics. It's really linked to the context of what's happening in our data set. So there's a lot of things in data sets that we can't see just by looking at them. And so what it does is it looks at that data set and it ensures that there's some type of real effect or real relationship with the larger population because it's accounting for all of those little things that we can't see from just reading it. And when we find that a hypothesis test or one of the analyses we're going to do, like regression, chi-square, ANOVA, t-test, when we find that there is statistical significance in what we're trying to measure, and basically means that this didn't occur randomly. Whatever I did that I'm studying, if it's statistically significant and you've done your sampling correctly, you've adjusted your bias, then it's only the responsibility of what you've done and the treatment that you instituted as far as saying that this is what made the change. And that's why it's so important that we do those other components. So the test we're going to study in here is a t-test, and you're going to notice that I use a lot of keywords in what I do. So the keyword for a t-test is compare. It compares two groups to determine if there's a statistically significant difference between them. So if I'm looking at students in the academic track versus fast track, the fast track students might do better because they're in honors classes, but is that quote unquote better statistically significant? A t-test can tell me that. So we're going to study that in this class. Same thing with an ANOVA. So the difference is an ANOVA can do 3 or more groups. And again, I'm comparing the means to see if they're statistically significantly different. Regression predicts. So if I want to predict something, I would use a regression. And basically we say, okay, does the years that a teacher has tenured in the system or has put into the system predict student performance? Then I can enter how long the teacher's been teaching in one column. And in the other column, I can enter the scores for the students. And I can literally come up with an equation that predicts it as long as it meets the criteria. And then with the chi-square test, I look for an association between two categorical variables. So these are all of the ones that we're going to study in this class, and we're going to spend time on these. One, actually, t-test, I think we do over 2 weeks, and same thing with ANOVA. But we're going to spend time, we're going to calculate these in SPSS. We're going to really talk about when to use them, how to interpret them, because inferential statistics should really be enabling you as a dissertation researcher to make meaningful predictions and conclusions that can be applied in your field. As long as you're controlling that sample, as long as you're controlling for bias, and you're looking at reliability and validity. So if I was looking at the steps that I would conduct inferential statistics, first, I have to define my population and my sample. Who are they? How many people are in the population? So many dissertation students ask me, how large does my sample size have to be? And my answer is, how large is your population? Because we work backwards. We have an actual formula that tells us that. Then you're going to formulate a hypothesis. What do you think is going to happen? And we're going to talk about that in class. Like, how do we write a null versus an alternate hypothesis? Then you're going to choose the correct tests between the ones that you have that we've studied in this class. You're going to conduct that test. So you're going to do the analysis, gather your own data. Then you would interpret it, and then you would make inferences about the population. This is the cycle for chapters 3, 4, and 5 for your dissertation. So basically, this is the process that you would move through in inferential statistics for a quantitative style dissertation or a mixed method with a quantitative component. And finally, why are they important? So they're important because we want to be able to generalize what we're learning about our sample to what we know about our population. They also really help us make decisions. If we're trying to determine if one pedagogy is better than another, if one curriculum is better than another, then we need the data to make an informed decision and to understand if the difference is statistically significant. And then finally, we understand the variability that happens within the data. So students have bad days. So you may have some variability within the data where you have some outliers just because the student had a bad day. And so when I use inferential statistics, there are different ways that I can control for that and I can actually improve that. And so I want to make sure that I utilize those trends so that I can understand the variability in the data set. And that is inferential statistics.